It's always a pleasure to be here in Barcelona. Thank you. And also a pleasure, again, to have the opportunity to meet with friends and so many interesting people at the walk. So thank you. Thank you. I have a cold today, so my voice might sound strange and I might cough or I might cry, but it's not true. It's just my eyes are watering. This is the theme I chose for this presentation. Why? Oh, thank you. Oftentimes, the question is raised to people in higher education about how can higher education proceed to prepare students for productive functioning in modern society. That's a standard question. With that question in the back of my mind, I've chosen this theme. My background, I am my background. And then I became involved in teacher education, mathematics teacher education. Well, it would be a long time ago. And then moved into computer applications in education. I've been an academic for all of my career, for most of my career, including as a senior professor at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. And I've taught many, many courses. But I've also done a considerable amount of work in the corporate sector with corporate learning. As Fran mentioned this morning, there's a instinctive reaction in the corporate sector to think that e-learning could save costs or make things more flexible or more efficient. So thus I would get called in. I always try to promote a very bottom-up view of learning, not that sort of view. Fortunately, it's been, I think, well received. In particular, I've worked 8 years for Shell Learning, in the working with technical professionals. These are people with degrees in petrophysics, geology, chemical engineering, petroleum engineering. Most of these people have PhDs, but it's still critical that they're learning stay up to date because of a rapidly changing field from a technological side. So, in working with Shell for those 8 years, I also examined many other corporate learning situations, especially those that were described as good practice. And from that, I want to distill a few highlights that I've observed that characterize good practice in corporate learning and suggest messages that these could have for university learning. Because my observation is that the difference between good learning in the corporate setting, in the way that it occurs, in the way it's recognized, in the way it's valued, is very, very different from the way learning is handled and managed in higher education in general. So, first of all, a few of the key observations I've made about workplace learning. And again, by workplace learning, I'm thinking of the learning that occurs in response to the needs of your profession, of your work. The first observation is that learning is recognized and acknowledged as occurring in many different ways. Taking courses is a very small piece of the picture. This is a result of a study done in England looking at the typical forms of learning that are being identified in good workplace settings. a key situation in workplace settings is that each professional meets with her team leader or line manager, whatever the name is, at least once a year and develops a personal development plan. And this is used very much as a basis for determining your eventual progression and pay-related progress. The personal development plan indicates that you must formulate and indicate very clearly the learning challenges that you expect to encounter in the course of your work during the year, and a variety of different strategies you're going to have for responding to your learning needs. And not only to your learning needs, responding to the learning needs of the whole organization. That is a critical difference. There's hardly many examples available of a student in higher education feeling responsible for the learning of other students. In the corporate setting, you are, because you're all together, working together for the common context. So that's one key observation which will turn up in my examples later on. To recognize and plan for and also annotate and be recognized for many different sorts of learning situations, especially those that involve your helping others. Now, in the course of my contacts with companies, I often ask the question to the employers who worked with new graduates, new entries, and what their frustrations were with these new workers. And as I say, these are people with PhDs in many cases, or at least a master's. They're not, they're already people who have been successful in an academic setting. I've identified 3 of the concerns, complaints that came up over and over again. The new graduates just don't know when, where, what, and how to learn. They're too conditioned to expect the course syllabus to tell them what they're going to learn, to tell them they're going to learn it between January 1st and March the 3rd, to tell them what they're going to do, to tell them what books they should read. That sort of thinking is not compatible with the need to find the right people to ask the right questions. Asking the right questions is critical, and knowing how to find appropriate sources to respond to those questions is equally critical. So an important employer frustration is that new graduates tend to still be waiting to be told. And that is not the way to be successful or productive in a complex workplace. A second observation. It's critical to work with multidisciplinary teams. Certainly in a technical field like petroleum engineering, every team involves people from different disciplines, usually different countries, many times only maybe not seeing each other face to face at all or very briefly. It's critical to understand how these teams can work on complex, fuzzy problems, not textbook problems, but problems where there's not enough information or competing information, where everything has to be interpreted and judged. These are high-pressure situations, high-pressure tasks, big deadlines, and a lot of money involved. All things that we can't or don't have opportunity to expose students to in higher education. There has to be a quick way to find a mutual appreciation of the problem space, to work together to solve a problem, to work together to understand what each other's expertise can contribute and how best to talk a common language when you come from very different disciplines. Do employers think that students have good experience in this? No. Very few examples of students, even in graduate school, having the opportunity to work on this kind of authentic, complicated, fuzzy, multidisciplinary project. I know why. It's very hard to organize. It's very hard to handle across different faculties. I know. But anything can be done if we try hard enough. At the University of Twente, we had multidisciplinary design team projects as a requirement for our students because of our conviction that this is a skill that needs to be developed through practice. The last point I want to mention is the most critical one, I think, in terms of underlying conception of learning. The fact that you share responsibility for the learning of others. A sense of shared responsibility for knowledge building, knowledge sharing, not only within one's team and within one's discipline group, but also within one's whole organization. Learning is there to happen not just for you, but learning is valuable to the extent in which the whole organization now works better. That's a mental change from what our students have ever experienced. In general, people are not being evaluated at the end of the year with their progress review on how much they learned. It's what evidence they can show that they helped the organization function better, that they helped others to function better. That's an amazingly different mindset, and I do think we have the responsibility to look for some ways to get some of that feeling into the learning experiences of our students in higher education. Because these students have had very little experience in anything but being worried about their own grade, their own success. So, is it possible for higher education to provide some sort of better integration with these characteristics of good workplace learning? Is it possible for us to anticipate these frustrations of the experienced people in the workplace? I think so. And I'll just provide some examples. I already mentioned we are quite familiar at the University of Twente with multidisciplinary teams. Once you get it set up, students in the engineering faculty get their grade through the engineering faculty, and students in the computer science faculty get their grade through the computer science faculty, but they work together on the same project. A very important thing that you see happening in corporate learning is that a team to work productively has to learn how to help each other understand each other's main points of their discipline. If you have a physicist and a geologist and a petroleum engineer going out for a week to Bahrain in the desert, what do they need to know to help each other do the complex calculations and predictions and projections that have to be done? What we've developed at Shell is a method of each member of the team prepares if you like, a study guide or a learning guide or an overview or a help document for the other members of the team about her own discipline. What am I going to be contributing to this project? What do you have to know about what I'm going to do? What do you have to give me for me to do my part of the job well? What do you have to know about my calculations and approaches for you to do your job well? The Shell people like to call these making these. They made little booklets after a while. It evolved, and the geologists would say geology for dummies to give to the other guys on the team. Petrophysics for dummies. They thought that was funny, and so. But the idea was these resources were not only used by that team, but went into the corporate wiki. So these resources could be reused by other members of design teams who needed this sort of, or could value learning from these sort of resources. But they could also be used in a learning context more specifically, but in many different ways in a work context. So I think this is something that we could, I know this is something we can organize in higher education. I've done it. This is a useless slide in terms of seeing the detail, but I just wanted to remember it to talk to you about. It's an example from the University of London in the UK, where medical practitioners, this is in a Center for Medical and Healthcare, work together as a team to handle a complex diagnostic situation. And you needed different people. You needed biometric people. You needed more clinical people. You needed perhaps a pharmaceutical person on the team. You needed a number of people on the team to confront this diagnostic situation. So they routinely used wikis in two ways. First of all, for the team to do just this sort of cross-tutoring that I referred to. This poor example here is meant to show what one of the practitioners or one of the persons put in an example of how to interpret some quantitative data from an instrument, that came from one of the analyses. I think a biomedical person has these data. So he wanted to explain to his group how to understand these data. So he put it in the wiki. Interestingly enough, when they finished their cases, then they in fact made a public version of the wiki, cleaning up things which were more preliminary, and they made these public versions of the wiki available to others in the community, to practitioners, not only students in the course, but to practitioners and to upcoming students in the course, to study these wikis as a resource for examples of how to interpret complex data. So a nice example. And I heard about at least a very nice example like this occurring here at the Walk. We heard about it yesterday. It's from the research team is called eHealth Lab, I believe. I wrote it down, but doesn't matter. I think it's eHealth Lab. And an eHealth Lab, the objective is to support the practicum subject of the Master in Health and Nutrition. So first of all, there's a multidisciplinary team here, students in biostatistics and in nutrition. And they work together and use Web 2.0 tools to handle this interaction. Because they're Walk students, they're all at a distance, so the tools are very important. But they're just as important if you're face-to-face. You have to have a common workplace, a shared repository to refer to. You can't just look at each other and talk about analyzing complex data. Another example involves the e-portfolio. Many people study e-portfolios in higher education. E-portfolios are used in professional life to document your own growth and learning. That's good. But I'm more interested in e-portfolios as learning resources for others. So not just for yourself to show what you've learned or to reflect for yourself. Yes, that's good, but not, it's necessary but not sufficient, or doesn't doesn't move forward with this other line of thinking about learning. So for example, if in an area of study, let's say healthcare, just because I mentioned healthcare, if the e-portfolios of previous students were available, first-year students could be coached or guided in how they could look into those previous e-portfolios to see examples of how you relate artifacts to competencies, for example. So younger students or newer students to the discipline, let's say, can have an initial experience where they use the work of others and are guided to see how to learn from it. What do these competencies that every course, every body of study in higher education lists objectives and competencies? What do they mean in practice? What sort of example of work shows this competency or this performance? The second year, using the same repository, learning activities could include the second year student actually choosing themselves some artifacts. First of all, for their own use, but also anticipating what would be useful for others. When next year's first year students look at your choice of artifact, what do you need to tell them so that they can appreciate better how it matches, shows a match between a competency and production or artifact. So the choice of artifacts is not just to prove what you did, but to anticipate others making use of it. So the commentary that you write is not only for yourself, but anticipating how this would help a newcomer to the field. And then the third year could in fact be to produce your own or complete your own e-portfolio with, again, the idea that its value is going to be the extent to which it contributes to the resource base of the community. So I think this can be done. And it makes, it's a great example of showing how you can build on the work of learners to increase everyone's learning. I did this myself at the University of Twente with our master's program. I had the students do e-portfolio, but specifically with the idea of annotating how their choice of artifacts demonstrated meeting the objectives of the program. So we could use this as a marketing tool with prospective students. Here's our objectives, but here's what it means in practice, because here's the things that previous students have done to show that they've met the objective. We could also use it when they first came, the launch of the program. Here's what we expect. This is the sort of thing we mean when we talk about design an appropriate response to an educational problem. Here's a variety of examples. Now, you don't need to keep all the examples. You as the instructor can do filtering, so it's not an overwhelming field of things to look at. Of course, you might want to choose the best ones at the same time, and maybe one from students in education and one from students in medical field and one from students in a different sort of discipline. Sure. But it's a very powerful way to build up a much better resource to support what this program means in practice than just writing about it. An example of this is from the Open University of the UK. Excuse me. I'm losing my... They have many they have many programs in which people are learning to be designers, graphic designers, media designers, technology designers. And so they work very much to have a feeling of community of online designers. They call it the Open Design Studio. And again, the participants in the program, and they're all distance education people like WHATVHOW students, contribute artifacts to the design studio with some small annotation as to what the point is of the artifact. It's a very powerful resource, not only for the students themselves, but for the Open University in its interaction with professionals in the design field. Sorry. We heard about an example from the walk yesterday, which I think also illustrates this. It's the team called MEL. They are instructors in your health, nutrition, and health science department, if I remember. And they were telling us about an idea they had for their own teaching and how they were initially frustrated by constraints of technology as it was available to them. What they wanted to do was have this is in their telemedicine master's program. In the telemedicine master's program, the students work with real practitioners in the field and do a study, a case study of some example of telemedicine in practice. These are the partners in the Barcelona area, but there are other collaborators in other places. So there's a lot of practitioners involved that are critical for this program, because otherwise they can't do a collaborative case study with authentic data. What the instructors wanted to do was to let all the collaborators, the professional collaborators in the field, look at the students' case studies as they were evolving and make comments, refer to those case studies later for their own work. These things were not possible given the institutional policies of the virtual campus at the Walk. They also wanted the second-year students, or the second semester students in the master's program, to look at these case studies for the reasons such as I just indicated, to learn from them, to anticipate the sort of work that they will be doing. Again, this wasn't possible, given the way the virtual campus is organized, for a second-year student to look at a fourth-year submission. So they have moved out of the virtual campus environment, and they are using a platform called iBook. That's I don't know if it's free, but it's a downloadable platform that you download from iTunes, and it's for people to make iBooks. An iBook is a sort of blog-like entity. So templates can be provided to make it easy to fill in information into an iBook. And they can be made available on the iBook community website. So what they've done is they've set up what they call the iBook Lab. They made a template for the case studies. Each graduate student, as their final project, makes an iBook for her case study. So there's a common format, easier to relate them to each other. So the student, working with her practitioner partner, makes her iBook case study, makes it available. The partners can give feedback on the accuracy of the product, but also comments to improve the product or praise for the product if it's the lucky case. They have set in using a publicly available tool called LinkedIn. They have facilitated communication, and they can have a closed view of LinkedIn so that the students' comments to each other and to their partners in the workplace are not being shown to the rest of the world. I think you can also make your iBooks available only to certain audiences as well. And from this, they will have at the end of the final project for these students, and there's, I think they said 60 or 80 of them, that's a lot of iBooks. They will have a wonderful resource there that will be used by all these medical professionals for their own value, and it certainly will be of value to subsequent cohorts of students in the program. I think this iBook Lab is a wonderful example of combining learning with multidisciplinary teams, of learning results being available and used and purposed for something other than your own gain, and for learning extending to a learning community, not just the course. Now, in order to help people think about how to get going with this kind of thinking in their own teaching, we made a simple flowchart here that can suggest how you can build up in complexity the sort of contributing related learning activities that I've been discussing. Make a contribution. Either you find something, you contribute it, or you adapt or create something and you contribute it. So that's the first step. Now, oftentimes that's as far as it goes. Many computer conferences end here. People think of something, maybe make a nice, maybe very nice, rich statement, they contribute it. That's it. What we're interested in is the next layer, where you build on this repository of contributions. The simplest level, just to look at them as a resource, to do more complex comparative learning activities with them, to do something to expand the collection. But what I really like is this sort of thing, and that's the example of the telemedicine group here at the Walk. They're making multiple reuse as an objective within, across, and outside of the course. Now, with that in mind, just before we started the meeting today, I was talking to Marcello, and we just got started on a discussion about what he's doing and his colleagues are doing with wikis within the e-learning center's program, master's program on IT and education. He told me that the name of I don't know if it's the project or the wiki, they call it WikiRao, but I never got the chance because something happened to find out more about it. So what I'd like to do is ask you how you use it in terms of this way of thinking. Explain to me a little about how WikiRao is being used in the learning math fundamentals of learning design course.
Well, it's part of an innovation project that we had with Lourdes here on my side. The idea was to author new educational resources that we usually do in our university, but we thought about why not thinking about creating or authoring open educational resources, and we were acting as what we call SME, not small medium enterprises, but subject matter experts, and our role was to develop a first what we call version, an expert version of this open educational resource, but we wanted to keep it open and we wanted to use it within the course. So we thought that it would be useful to develop this resource, taking into account the insertion of this resource within a learning process. So we developed some activities, and with these learning activities, and we decided to leave some part of this, what we call open educational resource, open to be completed by students through this learning process and through the activities in order to augment this learning resource to be reused again later.
So here and here? And how will you reuse them again?
We are reusing that in two courses. One is this assist in the same course and reorienting in a more applied course. This is fundamentals, but it can nourish a more applied course in terms of actually developing design experiences using these models and these principles. So it's reused there, reorient, it's repurposed.
Thank you. That's an excellent example. You can see it yourselves from your own e-learning center master's program. I have to finish now. So, in conclusion, I chose two quotes from an important report done in England, in the United Kingdom, where the task force was formed by the government to to respond to this question. What should UK higher education be like in the 21st century? And two main conclusions from it are represented here. First of all, develop a situative perspective of learning as social practice. Those are difficult words for my idea of the situation, social practice, and here an explanation of it from the funding agency for higher education and for projects in the UK was, learners develop their identity through cooperation and specific communities of practice. I think the telemedicine example is an excellent example. I also heard a fine example yesterday from, I've forgotten the name of the group. But anyway, the telemedicine example is an excellent example of getting these students to already be visible members of the larger community of practice. The second quote is from your own former or colleague Manuel Castells. He says, see the role of the university in a broader context. The universities are no longer dominant in the knowledge game, but neither are they so alone. Universities will be nodes, very important nodes, in the knowledge networks that will pervade 21st century productive learning. So, in conclusion, what can we do in higher education? I think we should keep this in mind, anticipate the way that these students as future professionals are going to be challenged in their learning development, and move to a vision of learning that emphasizes knowledge co-construction and sharing across a professional community. Stop thinking just about a course and think in a broader perspective. Thank you.